Well, DHS Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen says the agency is treating the border crisis with the same protocols as a major national disaster. Let's bring in our first power panel, former Chief Counsel for the House Judiciary Committee, Julian Epstein, President of the National Border Patrol Council, Brandon Judd, and RNC Committee Chairwoman for California, Harmeet Dillon. Welcome to all of you.
Good evening.
Thanks, Shannon. All right, Brandon, I want to start with you. What is the truth, factually, party aside, ideology aside, about what's going on at the border?
So if you look at the crisis, we have the biggest problem that the United States Border Patrol has ever faced in its history. I worked in Tucson in the mid-2000s when it was the biggest crisis at that time. Now we're facing something completely different. We've had 25,000 people cross our border that were able to evade apprehension, that we don't know who they were, what their intentions are, that are now here in the United States. And they've done that because all of our resources are being taken to handle all of these asylum seekers. This is an actual crisis, and we have to do something about it. And if we don't, we're going to be in trouble.
Well, Julian, across the partisan divide, it seems like people are beginning to agree there is a crisis, whether they want to call it humanitarian or a national security crisis or both. I mean, they agree that the numbers that are surging past are now leading to a situation where more and more people are left in a situation where they're either going to be released, and they know that, and they're coming here as family units or as unaccompanied minors, or they're going to be turned around and really not have a chance to pursue the life they would like to, simply because the numbers, you know, CBP has said it's catastrophic. They cannot handle the processing. What do you say?
I think you're sticking your head in the sand if you don't agree or acknowledge that there's a crisis here. We're seeing illegal crossings increase by a factor of threefold or fourfold. So I don't think there's much debate that we are facing a crisis here. I think Secretary Nielsen's letter to Congress was a very good and compelling explanation of the crisis. I think you have to, the key question here is whether we're just going to see a bunch of chest thumping and political posturing, or we're really going to try to fix the problem. And I think fixing the problem involves first using efforts at the front line, carrots and sticks with Mexico and our Central American, who should be allies. Central America is falling into disrepair. You're seeing authoritarian leaders who are affiliating with criminal syndicates. It's chaos, and the U.S. has got to step in and play a leadership role. I think cutting off aid is the wrong thing to do. That's the first step. The second step is border security. The system for processing, whether it's asylum seekers or people trying to come in under other forms, other laws in the immigration system, is completely broken. The system's overwhelmed. We don't have the ability to handle the number of people that are crossing. We don't have the security forces. I mean, the system is in complete disrepair.
Yeah.
The third part of this is once people get here, what Secretary Nielsen refers to as the big suck, the incentives for Central Americans to come to the United States. We're doing nothing about that. We're doing nothing about visa overstays. We're doing nothing about employer sanctions. Yeah. If we're serious about this, we've got to deal with all three prongs. Using carrots and sticks with their Central American countries, fixing the border security problem and the processing problem, which is in complete disrepair, and then taking away all the incentives for people to abuse the system once they're here.
I mean, Harmeet, let me bring you into this because it's interesting because the New York Times also points to this, as did the president today, that it's a two-pronged, really big issue as far as the immediate enforcement here. He says Mexico and he says Congress. New York Times says this: migration surge from Central America was spurred in part by Mexican policies. According to migrants, local officials, and migration scholars, this increase in northward migration has been partly spurred by the policies of President Andres Manuel López Obrador of Mexico. Deportations have plummeted under his watch. Now, the president, Harmeet, tonight speaking at an event, he did say, listen, Mexico is stepping up. We're starting to see some action from them. But he's told them it is going to be really rough for you. I'm going to close down this border. He said today that security is more important to me than trade. But he also said to Congress, you got to get something done. And he says it's two-pronged. Those are the two responsible bodies.
Yes. Well, the problem here is that the president seems to be the only one really taking leadership and trying to propose some solutions here. I think closing some of these 50 border checkpoints and crossings is one area that he could do, but it's going to hurt Americans as well. What we really are not talking about here is that members of Congress on the Democratic side and some on the Republican side actually are okay turning a blind eye to this significant problem. And Democrats, quite frankly, are pandering to this voter base because they see it as a future voter base for them. So they actually actually don't want to stem this problem. They think it's fine, and they spend all day long, and we haven't talked about the fact that most of these candidates for president on the Democratic side are condemning what our government is doing at the border to try to keep Americans safe, and that's outrageous. And so when you have Jay Johnson, when you even have CNN commentators talking about this being a crisis and having abuses in our asylum system, we need some legal reforms of the asylum system. We need to plug those loopholes. We need to provide more human beings at the border on our border forces to take care of these people, make sure there isn't violence. We have human trafficking going on across this border. This is a really serious problem. Kristen Nielsen talked tonight about the fact that there are actually gangs of people who are recycling children at the border. They bring them across with a family and then they send them back. They're like human passports. That's outrageous. Turning a blind eye to it, as our politicians are doing in Washington, is compounding human suffering on both sides of the border.
Unfortunately, we're out of time on this issue, but that's something we should all be able to agree on, regardless of party or ideology, that kids should never be used or trafficked that way. We got to find some solutions. So we appeal to those who can legislate those, and that's not us. Anyway, thank you, panel. Great to have you with us.
Thank you.
All 9 Republicans on the House Intelligence Committee calling for Congressman Adam Schiff to resign as chairman of the committee in the wake of the Mueller report. They accuse the California Democrat of misleading the public by citing evidence of Trump-Russia collusion, even after the report cleared the president of such a charge. Joining me right now is Fox News contributor Trey Gowdy. He is a former Republican congressman from South Carolina, and he is the former chairman of the House Oversight Committee. He is also a former federal prosecutor. And Congressman, it's always a pleasure to see you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Well, assess that. I mean, have you ever seen anything like that? 9 Republicans are asking the chairman to step down. What is your reaction to Adam Schiff's behavior?
Never seen that before. We had a lot of bad days the 8 years I was in Congress, but we never voted to remove or ask a chairperson to step down. Adam is a deeply partisan person. He did everything he could to make sure that Hillary Clinton became the next president, and he's done everything he could since he failed at that to keep a cloud over the Trump presidency. So the folks on the House Intelligence Committee on the Republican side, Maria, are not members of the Crazy Caucus. They're not bomb throwers. It's Elise Stefanik. It's Will Hurd, who was a CIA employee. It's Johnny Ratcliffe, who was a terrorism prosecutor. It's not part of the Crazy Caucus. These are reasonable Republicans, all of whom unanimously said, Adam, we've lost confidence in your ability to lead. And I think the next thing that's going to happen is the different intelligence communities, the different intelligence entities are going to say, you know what, Chairman Schiff, if you don't believe the information we provide to you, if you prejudge the outcome of investigations, if you have the President of the United States not just indicted but in jail, and you continue to leak like a screen door on a submarine, we're going to quit giving you information. That's when Pelosi will replace Adam Schiff with someone like Jim Himes, who's every bit as progressive. He's just a lot smarter and a lot more reasonable.
Well, you make a lot of good points, because here's a guy who's running around with his title and spewing out things that are actually coloring people's knowledge of what actually went down. You questioned John Brennan. Same story here. He's a former director of the CIA. So when you hear that title, you see that resume, you stop and you listen. And yet it was back in May of 2017 when you poked holes in his idea that the president had committed treason. He used that word on CNN many times. Here's that exchange between you and Brennan last year.
It's a really simple question. Did evidence exist of collusion, coordination, conspiracy between the Trump campaign and Russian state actors at the time you learned of 2016 efforts?
I encountered and am aware of information and intelligence that revealed contacts and interactions between Russian officials and U.S. persons involved in the Trump campaign that I was concerned about because of known Russian efforts to suborn such individuals. And it raised questions in my mind, again, whether or not the Russians were able to gain the cooperation of those individuals. I don't know whether or not such collusion, that's your term, such collusion existed. I don't know. But I know that there was a sufficient basis of information and intelligence that required further investigation by the Bureau to determine whether or not U.S. persons were actively conspiring, colluding with Russian officials.
sufficient basis? And let me correct myself. That was 2 years ago. 2 years ago, you poked holes in this narrative. How did this happen, Congressman? So how do you launch a major investigation into a candidate who's running for president based on no predicate?
Well, let me first note, Maria, that was a Republican asking a question about collusion, because you would never know that if you read the Washington Post and the New York Times. They wanted you to believe that Republicans didn't care about collusion. That was a Republican on national television asking about collusion. It began because of a guy named Peter Strzok, with his historic animus towards Trump in July of 2016, launching a counterintelligence investigation into the Trump campaign. This is about 10 days before he talked about an insurance policy. It was after he said Clinton should win $100 million to nothing. It was after he said Trump would be destabilizing for our country. It was just before he said he had no interest in being part of the special counsel unless it led to impeachment. That's the guy who started the counterintelligence investigation into President Trump. But that's the same investigation that a lot of my Republican colleagues now want you to read the report. It was a flawed ab initio from its inception investigation. And now some of my Republican colleagues want you to read a report on a flawed ab initio investigation.
Trey, you said a minute ago this was based on a faulty investigation from the start. What about the AG releasing the full Mueller report? Where are you on that?
Maria, I bifurcate the investigation and therefore the report. Part of it is what did Russia do in 2016? I am all for my fellow citizens understanding what Russia tried to do to this country. I think it'll be unifying. The other part of the equation is with whom, if anyone, did they do it? And Mueller, Adam and Swalwell and Beto, they all talk about evidence beyond a reasonable doubt. That's what it takes to convict. Mueller didn't even find the lowest level of evidence that anyone in the Trump campaign did it with Russia. There's not even probable cause. So I realize the populist thing to do is say release it all, which, by the way, is against the law. You can't release it all. Let's assume you can just release what you can that's not classified. We are now in the uncharted territory of releasing reports on people for whom there is not even the lowest level of evidentiary standard, not even probable cause. And once you begin to go down that path where you're going to issue reports and do press conferences on people who are not indicted, for whom there's no evidence they committed a crime, then we're in a brand new day politically when the department can do Oppo research on a campaign and then under the guise of a report release it but never charge them. I hope we never get to that point, and that's why I'm in a very small minority that doesn't think that part of the report should be made public. I realize I'm in the minority, but I'm not a populist.
Yeah, I noticed that John Ratcliffe took a little walk when the vote came, so he also agrees don't release it because it's not right, and for all the reasons you just mentioned. Look, as I think about this, I feel like this whole thing started by the Clinton machine. Hillary Clinton wanted dirt on Donald Trump. She paid for the dossier. They protected her for her own investigation. It's just extraordinary where we are as we look back. Congressman, it is good to see you this morning. Thank you.